Let's talk about trade with the US first, because you've made an eloquent defense of the trading system. There'll be a decision to be made in the next few weeks about how the Europeans respond to a direct challenge to that system. The Americans putting on tariffs on what are largely regarded as spurious national security grounds on steel and aluminium. Now, does the European Union retaliate? Does it retaliate double in order to punish? Or do you say, oh, you'll get over it, just let's not try and escalate this?
Well, this is not about escalation. It's about finding the appropriate answer to this. We made it very clear that, on the one hand, we're ready for dialogue, ready to talk, but not sort of under this sword of Damocles, but only if it is clear that we are exempt from such tariffs on aluminium and steel, and also, as the case may be, with the World Trade Organizations. After all, we have certain measures that we put in place, which we would then impose. But we said it's the World Trade Organization that is then in charge of imposing those, because we feel committed to the multilateral trade system, and we have said that for the EU, but maybe we don't need to use them.
So some retaliation would be, because the WTO allows you to retaliate if it finds against. So you are saying some retaliation, because the danger of retaliation is you encourage or escalate the conflict, and the conflict may escalate anyway. President Trump may go after German cars. But I just wonder whether you feel you've got in your back pocket a kind of a strategy to deal with this looming problem.
Well, we have to say that, unfortunately, ever since 1994, the WTO has not been able to come up with a new comprehensive trade agreement, because there have always been along the road countries that were not willing to enter into agreements, and that led to a whole host of bilateral agreements. WTO's rules allow for this if 90% of the goods are covered by such a bilateral trade agreement, and this is why the European Union now has forged with a number of countries such trade agreements. For example, we have one with South Korea, we've just completed one with Japan, we will negotiate with Australia and New Zealand, we have completed it with Singapore, and there's been a lot of contentious discussion about CETA, as you know, the agreement with Canada. We were actually on track for negotiating a comprehensive trade agreement with the United States, so-called TTIP. There's no reason, really, just because there is a new president, to refuse to have any dialogue with the Americans. We talk to the Mexicans, we talk to Canada, we're talking to Mercosur, but we're not talking with the US. I am ready to do so. I am not saying that all of the tariffs that were sort of set in 94 are still in line with the current situation and do not need to be adjusted. But this has to be done on the rules-based established by the WTO.
Let's talk about another fire, which you might have to deal with fairly soon, is Italy. Because in a way it's the same point about these annoying voters vote in a way that you probably wouldn't vote for the wrong people, and taking it from your perspective. The president in Italy yesterday essentially said, no, you can't have the finance minister, the economy minister you want. I'm going to stop that. And in a way, I suppose the big dilemma is, do you counter populism by standing up to it? Or do you counter populism by trying to be nice to it? And I wonder what your view of the Italian situation is at the moment.
No, I don't think that this is about being nice. It's always about standing up for one's own convictions. But as I said in my introductory remarks, globalization actually does affect different people differently. And we've seen that in the global financial crisis, for example. Many of the bankers who, just vanished with a lot of money and no longer have to work think for the rest of their lives. They bear responsibility for a lot of people being unemployed now in Europe. And these people do stand up and say, do you think this is fair? Well, we didn't have any rules for banks at the time. It was we followed the rule too big to fail. If you were big enough, you were able, at the expense of the taxpayer, to somehow keep your business afloat. And that shaping the financial markets is a great task. I don't judge any voter, neither in Germany nor in Italy. We are, after all, democracies. I think those who have been given the task of shaping politics, they have to find solutions. That is sometimes more difficult. This is why I think it's such a good thing that this event here is called Solutions. How can we do this? It was always been my approach. How can we get employment for the people? And this is what we need to discuss. And this is, after all, what moves people. We have to take this up. We have to take it seriously. The European Union has always held this promise of success, of prosperity. And if millions of people feel, well, this promise hasn't been fulfilled for them, whether this be in the vicinity of London or be it in Portugal or maybe in some areas in Greece, then we have to deal with this. We have to tackle this issue and we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to solve it? And if today we say, years after the financial crisis, all of the Euro countries are growing, unemployment is slowing down, then this is a first step, but not one that is satisfactory, obviously.
You didn't quite answer the Italian question. Are you worried about what's happening in Italy? Because it looks like another election there.
Sie haben mich gefragt, ob man nett sein soll. Und dann
You asked me, should I be nice? And I said, no, no. I think one ought to tackle the problems and solve them. And at the same time, we ought to take a very close look at where we can cooperate with the government, but always remembering that we have principles in the euro area. There may be difficult issues then that we need to discuss. For example, when in Greece the election was on the horizon and Alexis Tsipras was voted into office, a lot of questions were on the agenda, and we spent many nights discussing these matters, but I think we were able to achieve something at the end of the day. That is the task that I see for myself, and Italy, after all, is a very important member of the European Union.
This will be useful for Italian voters. Do you see the Greece experience as a success?
Sie hat zumindest erst einmal
Griechenland kept Greece afloat and out of the immediate crisis. Not all of the tasks obviously are fulfilled, not all of the problems are solved. I mean, the European Union is not a state, it's not a nation state. A lot still lies with the nation states, a lot of the responsibility, and we have to give a boost to the economy in order to create good, sustainable jobs. We will talk to Italy about this no matter what government may be in place then.
The big issue is voters all over the place are having insurrections, rebellions against the established order. And so what we're looking for is whether or not the public have good reason to be angry and whether something can be done to satisfy that anger, or whether you fight the voters. And you've carved a diplomatic position between those two positions. In the speech, you talked about finding inclusive growth, economic growth. Do you have actual practical policies that will deliver that? I mean, give me an example of 2 or 3 specific things that you can do, not for the people in Berlin who are very tied to the global economy, but people in bigger towns and small cities which maybe feel they've been left out, or maybe feel they haven't much path or trajectory or future. Give me 2 or 3 specifics, because that's what this whole event is about, is trying to find these things.
I
think one should never fight against voters. One should always try to enlist the support of voters by explaining to them why one has come to certain convictions, because we have a fair and equal and secret ballot. After all, for many centuries, people fought for this in the past. One felt the guilds ought to vote and the elites of a society. But I think that's most important, that each and every member of a society participates in this endeavor. This is why voters obviously think for themselves, and the more educated the people, the better equipped people are to actually think about what may be in the interest of a country. Let's say a master craftsman who for 30, 40 years is in his job and has come to a certain amount of prosperity and is handing over this to his children. And then these days he sees startups that within, let's say, 2 years' time, they earn 10 times the amount that he has ever been able to earn throughout his working life. And so and then people feel, am I being respected for what I am? Am I being valued for what I've done? Now, investments in infrastructure. I, for example, come from a rural area, one that is fairly remote, a constituency along the Baltic Sea, and it was essential for developing tourism to have good infrastructure, that we get an autobahn, a motorway, so that these beautiful areas can be reached by people who want to take vacation there, and that has given a boost to economic development. Now people feel, when do we get digital? When do we get broadband here in our rural areas? When can I teach my children that, give them access to this? A second point, where my party at first was on a different track, but where we learned over time that this is simply not acceptable, is a minimum wage. It was very difficult for us because we have this autonomy of the collective bargaining agreements of both sides of industry, but we saw that there are many professions that are simply not well paid, and this particularly in areas that are not so highly developed. And so I think a quarter of the people, actually earn more money and felt that their work was finally valued, was finally respected. Then we have people who have, let's say, a very difficult biography as regards their work, their professional life. They have maybe worked for 30, 40 years, but have not continuously been able to work, have not continuously paid into our pension fund, so and gets less than somebody who's worked who hasn't been in this country for that long. So we have a basic pension that we've introduced where they feel they can also give a contribution now.
Okay, look, I have many more, but I'm going to open up. I know we've got some people who prepared questions, and I want to take one or two of those just to open up to the floor. And I wonder if we can start with someone from our Young Global Changer program, Nancy Hock, who's an American, 35-year-old, reading an MBA, I think, at Berkeley. Where's Nancy? Nancy, go ahead. Give us your question, please. With the microphone, with the box, the cube.
Chancellor Merkel, guten Tag. My name is Nancy Hock. I'm from San Francisco, California, in the United States. I'm a business student and also a working mother in Silicon Valley. My question to you is, in the West, particularly within this discussion of this summit, people are waking up to something which you knew about a long time ago, and that is the leadership potential and capability of women. As the most powerful woman in the world, how are you going to continue this momentum and influence conversations within policies and leaders in the political and corporate realm in developed and developing nations? And how might we all work together to help you with this?
How do we enhance? Thank you very much, Nancy. How do we enhance the power of women in the world?
Great question.
Ja, also
Well, we can do this by opening up the same educational opportunities for women. I think we have to start from the bottom. We can do this, and I start with education by giving women the same opportunities right from the start in getting a good education, by making it possible for women to work and have a family at the same time. We will not be able, however, to do this without changing the way that men look at matters. if women are always responsible for having their own job and also for the family, and the men only have to look after their own career, then this will not work out in the end. There has to be some kind of area where both are made compatible, and you have to have role models, obviously, as they have been in existence for men for many, many years. You have to have fora where women perhaps support each other. In Germany, we are not there yet, unfortunately. Also with the big companies, for example, our initiative to have more women on the board has not yet been successful. In the political area, I think we've become better as regards female ministers and so on. But also among parliamentarians, we still have difficulty. At least my party has a lot of difficulties in finding women who want to become debated. So a lot remains to be done. But what's important is not only women have to change, women have to be given the same opportunities, but men too have to take over perhaps other different tasks at the same time.
Has a woman chancellor made a difference, do you think, in Germany to the culture of men being willing to change their roles and women elevating theirs?
Well, just because of a female chancellor, I don't think that has made that much of a difference. But it may well be perhaps a model for women that they see you can actually survive in this job, and you can actually survive quite well in this job. But this in and of itself will not be sufficient, I think.
Actually, that brings me to another. How long are you? What is your plan, survival plan? I mean, how long? You're not going to do a Putin, are you?
You know the promise I made that I will be there for this legislative term, and you cannot get more out of me for today.
We'll take another one. You mentioned the Argentinians are here, presidency of the G20 next year, and I think we've got one from Professor Beatriz Nofal from Argentina. Beatriz, wait for the microphone. Keep it tight, Beatriz, if you would. Thank you.
I will go. First, it was Argentina Sherpa last year during your leadership in the G20, having the presidency. So I want to thank you for your leadership in the name of Argentina. My question, you spoke about the intense pressure of the multilateral trade system. So my question is, can the G20, through a dialogue process and consensus building, give the appropriate answers? Do we need a new type of political agreement, and the G20 can serve as a platform between the traditional Quad, that is the United States and Europe, Canada and Japan, plus China and the emerging countries representing all of the developing countries? Can a positive multilateral trade agenda be built in the G20 so that we can afterwards negotiate with the WTO?
So it's a new trade, basically another trade deal.
Yes, we have to probably revisit the system because there is perception of imbalances, different perceptions.
Let's not call it the Doha round, but go ahead.
Naja, ich glaube,
well, I think that the that will probably overtax the strength of the G20. Well, there's one example that we have, for example, the excess steel.
Yeah, I only wanted to wait for the answer. It's about this,
there's one example, for example, excess steel capacity, where we set up this forum. We were trying to actually diffuse one particular trade problem through setting up this forum, but this interdependency across the board in trade of products is too large than being able to solve this in a forum such as the G20. What we can do is to say, well, we feel committed to the basic principle. As I said in my remarks, ever since 1994, I mean, that's 24 years ago, we have not actually come up with a new trade agreement. So there are many individual things that have been settled through bilateral trade agreements, and I think we have to first first come to some sort of level playing field again as regards bilateral trade arrangements, because people, after all, are quite satisfied with this. And then building on this, one might then perhaps launch a multilateral process. I don't want to bring the WTO chief into difficulty here or discourage him. There are certain matters that can obviously be discussed, but we have not really made the sort of progress we wanted to. And G20 can encourage, can embolden, but it cannot solve individual issues or all of the individual issues.
No. Okay, I'm going to take a last one of the questions. I'm sorry, not all the questioners are going to get their questions. We're very short of time. Colin Kelly from PwC, I think. Colin, just keep it as tight as possible, please.
Good. Chancellor Merkel, so our systems you described are under such strain, local, global, economic, social. A theme for this conference is recoupling, making economies work better for societies. What is your ask, your request of us, business leaders and policymakers, to make this more effective?
I think that, I mean, I've asked this question, how to bring about inclusive growth, and I think we in Germany, I think, can be actually quite proud, although we obviously have to readjust this time and again, of our market economy, social market economy, that is. So not giving market forces free rein, but also thinking of equality and a social balance. I think that's a good starting point. I see an enormous challenge for shaping globalization right now that we haven't talked about yet, namely the fact that the raw material of the 21st century are data. So it's no longer coal and steel or aluminium and copper, but data. And the question, how can I actually uphold this concept of a fair social market economy and adjust it in such a way that it covers data as well? We haven't come up with any convincing answers, neither in tax law nor in social legislation. We, all of us, are providing data. And considering the fact that we are permanently giving those data away, as it say, for free, well, you have then on the other side those who are earning a lot of money with it. So if people know that much about my tastes, about my language, about my readiness to participate in this discussion, which tells people quite a lot about my personality, and then they use this to market products. If this were, for example, to yield the same sort of revenue as collecting potatoes in a field, well, we don't have a price tag attached to that as yet. Everything else is priced, but not this. So that leads to enormous imbalances and injustices in the world today. We have to build this into our tax systems, but in such a way that it is not completely disruptive compared to our current legislation on taxes. We have a rather interesting discussion going on right here. We say we have a corporation tax, so companies pay taxes, but we would also like to tax Facebook, Google, Amazon. And then people say, well, we don't really know what they do, how their activity. Look at turnover. This percentage, X percentage on turnover. Well, Facebook, well, clearly, internet, smartphone. Let's look at the car. The car is developing continuously. In the end, you don't know, is it actually a computer on wheels, or is it just a commodity that we've known from old? So tax legislation also has to be adjusted. We have to think of that. Pricing data, particularly the data of consumers, I feel is the central issue that we need to solve in order to ensure a fair and equitable world of the future. That's a very interesting issue for Mr. Snow to discuss, for Professor Snow to discuss and debate. We politicians can only listen very carefully, but that's, I think, one of the most difficult issues that we need to resolve.
We're almost there. I suppose your speech was about multilateralism and how it's lost its appeal in the world to some extent. Many people are against. Economic nationalism has become a big force against it. I suppose I'm wondering whether I understand your diagnosis. Why is there that backlash? What has happened? We had 70 years of apparent success in the world. What has happened that mean people all over the place are saying, no, I want to be nationalist, I don't want to be multilateralist? I mean, what's interesting is this has happened really in the last 10 years. It's happened, since the economic crash. Maybe you put it down to that. But what is it? Is it racism? Is it manipulation by evil demagogues? What do you think?
Na gut, das ist ja eine Frage, auf die ich nur
I mean, that's a question where I can only address one facet of an answer. When I think about this, I usually conclude that we live in a way in a twofold turning point and a crossroads. There are people who have, for example, experienced the Second World War as the last truly global catastrophe. Most of them are sort of age, some in their dotage, some are actually no longer with us. So from this horrible experience, they have made something that seems almost impossible. They did not stay in their enmity. They were trying to bridge those gaps, those chasms. They were trying to forge friendships. Maybe the pressure today isn't so big. Maybe because people for 70 years have lived in peace, they think, oh, it's not so dangerous. This is why I said it's much, much harder to turn the lack of peace again into peace, which we see in Syria, for example. We shouldn't underestimate that. And there's another thing that we ought not to underestimate. We live at a time of complete technical revolution, which is comparable, as we say here in Germany, with the invention of the printing press, or maybe the transition from an agricultural society into an industrial society. There's a complete sea change. 90% of the people at the advent of the industrial age were farmers, were peasants. These days, 2% are farmers in our country. So within just one generation or maybe two generations, this enormous restructuring process has to be also understood by people. Digitalization, for example, is a completely disruptive innovation and technology, and we should not underestimate the effect of this. When you sort of have this transition from a machine tool that all of a sudden it's digitalized from a machine tool of the old time, it's very difficult for a laborer to understand this and to accept that. And when everywhere people feel that they are boxed in, you're trying to get some room for yourself and you're trying to get a little bit more for yourself, but we have to see to it that it is enough for each and everyone.
We'll leave it there. We are, as Dr. Merkel said, at a time of transition, and it's extremely difficult to navigate and to govern when you're just on a straight road and driving the car in one direction. But when you're at a time when you're in a fog without a map and you're trying to navigate at the same time, it is difficult. I think we very much appreciate you giving us your time and for taking some of our questions. Thank you, Chancellor Merkel.